It is 1 o'clock. Welcome, T-Rock members and members of the public, and perhaps members of the press if they have joined us for today's proceedings. We have 2 busy hours in front of us. I do appreciate everyone's rejoining us. My name is Paul Caulfield, and I will be co-facilitator today, helped by, as always, Keith Chase. And we will work through a number of opportunities today. The first thing I should point out is that we are recorded. I think the message tells you that when you come on, but I'll give you an idea of the outlook for us today. I encourage people to use the chat feature throughout. Members of the public, if you are joining us, there are methods of submission available to you as well through the channel you're on. And at the end of the session, we reserve some time, about 10 minutes, for brief comments from members of the public, especially those who are unable otherwise to enter information. So those on a cell phone where perhaps that's their only means of access. That's what we designed it for. But if otherwise you just want to speak up, that's okay as well. Today's agenda, I'll hit the objectives in a moment. We'll hear from our commission chair. And just a quick look at our schedule and milestones. And then Keith's going to talk us through a few principles that have sort of settled in for the overall proposal. We're not so far off from having to really put something on paper and start to make something of this charge that we have received. We're going to take a look at a lot of hard work that's been done by the work groups, and then especially by the work group leads in consultation with others over the last week or so. And some of them got together as recently as this past Monday. So this thing is moving fast, but I won't read the various names of those work groups to you, but suffice it to say that we have some revenue proposals, or at least some estimates that we think are starting to take the form of options to either consider or go on record and recommend. So we want to see if today we can work toward consensus on the most viable, the most promising of those options. That's about the first half of the meeting, and then we pick up with 2 briefings. So backed by popular demand, Jen Granger, our Deputy Secretary for Multimodal Transportation, will talk about this emerging opportunity of taxing or creating fees that accompany package delivery. That can take a lot of forms, and Jenny's been looking into that. Then we'll hear from Mike, also backed by popular demand, this time on the PennDOT maintenance program. We'll wrap it up. We'll hear again from the commission chair and perhaps members of the public. Will point out here and again a little later that our next meeting will be on July 14th. So we're going to review and validate those revenue options that have been developed by the work group leads. They're not final by any means, and there will be input throughout that process. That input, as before, for commission members will take place on Mentimeter. It's hard for me to type and speak at the same time, but there I put the link to Mentimeter in. So if you want to get a head start, we're just going to have an open-end Mentimeter on each of the option categories, as well as our briefings. Try to get consensus toward a funding proposal. Then we're going to get that understanding of bridge maintenance, road maintenance needs, requirements, and just what those components are, and this whole package delivery. So pretty busy couple of moments that we'll be spending together today. So I'm sure that Secretary Gramian will get us roaring out of the start here.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Happy Thursday afternoon to everyone. We have a very full agenda today, as Paul mentioned, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussions. Many thanks to each of you for actively participating in T-Rock and not staying on the sidelines. Thank you also to the group leaders for moving our funding proposal further ahead. That is the primary focus for our meeting today. Today, our work groups will provide updates on projected revenues that could be gained from the various funding options we've been discussing. We will also hear a briefing from Deputy Secretary for Multimodal Transportation, Jenny Granger, on the feasibility of a package tax. This proposal is gaining traction at the state as well as federal level. It's referred to as beneficiary pay system rather than users pay system. This approach recognizes that in our modern economy, there are many beneficiaries who are not users of the national highway system, but are definitely dependent on it. It argues and recognizes that many who benefit from our transportation system do not pay for its upkeep or improvement. For instance, anyone who has packages delivered to their front door or uses ride-sharing services or shops at a retailer that gets goods delivered by truck are beneficiaries of the national highway system, even if they never get behind the wheel of a car. So please pay close attention to the stats and numbers and evaluate the feasibility and value of this option. Also, as Paul mentioned, Acting Deputy Secretary for Highway Administration, Mike Kaiser, will share information on how we fund our highway and bridge maintenance activities at PennDOT, as many have brought up concerns and questions about the level of funding and spending on our maintenance system. Finally, this is our 7th T-Rock meeting. As you know, number 7 has had lots of significances throughout human history, from ancient times all the way to today's best-selling books such as The 7 Habits. It also happens that number 7 relates to our attention span and memory capacity. With that in mind, we have a couple more meetings scheduled in July with the goal of developing our transportation options playbook in support of addressing Commonwealth's challenges, quality of life, economic growth, and strategies for the next several years and beyond. So always, before we get started with our discussions, may I have a motion to approve our minutes from our June 14th meeting?
This is Paul.
This is Amy, so moved.
We do have a motion. May I have a second?
I second. Howard Cohen seconds.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks, everyone. We have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. Any objection to the approval of the minutes? Hearing none. Motion approved. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Paul.
Excellent. Thank you. So here's the outlook. We are still in June, if barely, and trying to complete some other sections of the strategic proposal along the way, but really trying to get at those recommendations. It's really that simple. So a look ahead, July 14 and 28, we switched it up on you. It's Wednesdays. We'll need an extra day. We'll probably need all we can get toward the very end of July to formulate the ultimate recommendations, the final report for the governor. At this point, I will ask Keith Chase to join us and talk a little bit about some of the principles that have developed throughout the conversation thus far and how they may factor into the recommendations.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, commissioners. As we are following this compressed schedule, it's easy to focus on the spreadsheets only, as important as they are to coming up with a funding proposal. The governor's executive order uses a very important phrase, which is strategic proposal. And so to be a strategic proposal, we obviously need to complete our work in ways that is much more than an accounting or a budgetary exercise. The list before you has been developed based on what we've heard to date. And in some cases, some of the principles may still be in conflict and need to be ironed out. But ultimately, we would envision that within the strategic proposal that the executive order calls for, there would be something along the lines of a preamble or an introduction before the proposal for short-term, medium-term, and long-term funding, otherwise now known as phase 1, 2, and 3, that there be some discussion of the principles, the cohesion for the package. I won't read all these to you, but I will touch on a few. And more than that, I would ask you to keep these in mind, that as you hear from the various work groups, the work group leaders, think about the principles that represent cohesion, that ultimately would represent that glue which holds the entire proposal together. Obviously, we've heard of equity in a number of ways, being mindful of the impacts and implications of various revenues, whether or not they're regressive or progressive. There's been a keen focus already on the transportation user as the focal point for new revenues. Yet at the same time, there has been at least some recognition that we need to broaden and diversify the revenue base. There are obviously some limits to that that are being spoken to. You're going to see some of those in a few moments, including, and I say this neutrally, an aversion to non-transportation taxation. Based on where we've been historically, we know we must consider the stability of revenue sources. Transportation capital funding needs to be predictable, needs to be stable, and Deputy Secretary Kaiser will make it very clear to you why adjustments for inflation are so vitally important as part of doing what you're doing, and that's developing a modern transportation revenue strategic proposal. TROC has been quite attentive to being the T in TROC transportation, not highways and bridges only, nor state only. So one of the principles that appears to be emerging, positive but yet highly challenging, is to be flexible across modes and locally as well. There are obviously limits to that in terms of certain funding sources that are restricted, but there's also a fair amount of funding mechanisms, revenue mechanisms that could be flexible. I told you I wouldn't read all of them, so there's 3 left, and I won't read those, but we will continue to keep an eye on what other states do. I took a little extra time going through this to give you a chance to fix this list somewhat in your mind, that as you hear the various proposals ahead, that you think about them in terms of overall principles, as well as some of the strategic directions that we'll be giving definition to as well with you in the very fast-paced weeks ahead. Thank you, Paul. And I saw on the agenda, of course, that we would consider any comments for this, either now or later. Any comments about the principles as shown?
And you can put them in chat or unmute and talk. If we get a lot of traffic, we'll ask you to raise your hand, but I didn't set up a Mentimeter for this one. Sorry.
I do have a question about the equity impacts item. Of course, that's important, but it's a difficult thing to measure, and I'm wondering, is there any way to model proposals that are in front of the commission to understand what the impact might be across demographic groups or across income groups or anything like that?
It's an excellent suggestion, Secretary Hassel, and to date, where we've had discussion that may be helpful to move in that direction of a way of evaluating beyond one single source, as we've talked about ad valorem for vehicle associated with vehicle purchase and registration. Part of that discussion has been one of the favorable aspects of ad valorem is that it recognizes ability to pay the value of the vehicle. But your comment is well noted that we should look for some filter, some kind of way in which we can look at any of the proposed revenue mechanisms to evaluate them in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Others? All right. Well said. Thanks again, Keith. Thank you, Secretary Hassel. We're going to step into some revenue projections, and these are out there. They're estimates. I'm going to just cover a couple of big picture items. What you're going to see today does tally up to the numbers in front of you. So in that phase 1 and 2 year phase, that is, you're going to see the constituents of about $2.7 billion in addressing need. So we didn't think we were going to wipe out the entirety of that need in that first phase, but as you progress, you're going to see that it elevates to about 5.7 billion in the 3-4 year. Out some years, and it may be a direct line projection, but at some stage out there, MBUF really starts to make a big difference. Not only does it offset the fuel tax reduction, but it also probably is, it may be stated a little high here because we probably would also see the sunsetting of some of the other options that will be put in place in the interim. So I would take the MBUF numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. It is something that can be calibrated ultimately to the established validated need, and something that can be made in line with where we end up in the other phases. The way these all come together, you're going to see that we kept the full value in for the state police redirection. That may not be realistic for the moment. It's underway, it's active right now. The fees add up to 1.1 billion, taxes somewhat limited at 535 million, tolling 2.6 billion, and then other 547 million. So those numbers actually add up to somewhere between, if I can jump back for a second, they really add up to somewhere between the 2.6, 2.7 and the 5.7, because some of those, as evaluated, really don't take place until phase 2. So it's kind of a blend of phase 1 and phase 2 when you look at these overall revenue numbers. We don't have the MBUF in here. Bringing the MBUF in separately, it might be something on the order of $11.5 billion. It's big numbers, but I'm going to turn now to our work group lead for that. And this is something that's changing minute by minute, and Ron's been very diligent at doing calculations and projections. So Ron, just a couple of points up here you might want to talk to. And
Paul,
yep.
Howard Cohen, before
Yes, Howard.
we get into the MBUF, which is important, in the first phase, there is no calculation for anticipated revenues from the federal government infrastructure bill. That is coming together rather rapidly. And while we probably can't put a number on it, although I'm sure PennDOT and others have people down there keeping an eye on this, I wonder if at some point we don't need a footnote or recognition that the federal program is being negotiated, is moving forward, and there could be a input for the first phase, which would close the gap, if not cover the gap.
Yep. Excellent point. Excellent point, Howard. Thank you. Yes, you are certainly right. It is not accounted for here. And perhaps this is a happy day and things are moving in the right direction even today as we speak. So that will have to be reconciled.
Come on.
Ron, here's a big wide 11.5 billion for you, but I'm going to move you on kind of the fine print here.
Come on.
No, that is a big number.
Cross.
I wonder if we could have everyone who's not Ron Drenovich or Paul Caulfield's please mute at present. There you go, Drenny.
Okay. Yeah, it is a big number. Of course, we're looking at a big need too. It's interesting that the additional dollars are so significant compared to where we are right now with a $4.6 billion program from Liquid Fuels in Pennsylvania. And that's state and federal money, so they are together. And there's some question on where that number stands. It was higher before, it's lower this past year because of COVID and some other things, and I'm not sure how that's projecting up. But the department is looking at where that might go. Anyhow, the current need is, we're only talking what's being covered by Liquid Fuels now. The current need is 12.7 billion, which is the 9.3 billion pending need for what we're trying to do, which 8.1 of that is highway and bridge added to what the current budget. Anyhow, 12.7 is a big number, and it does not include inflation, and you got to put something on that, and I think that's going to be addressed a little bit later. But I put in a soon 2%. Hard to tell if that's what we'll see over the next 8 or 10 years. You know, all of this is in infant stages at this point. this is a program that we would love to see in place in 10 years, but something will be in place, but it might not be what we would like to see. And it also doesn't include any contribution from the feds above what they have been providing up until now. And I hope it's fair to assume that the Fed's going to be an active player. I know that Howard just brought up the point that they're putting a program in place right now to do something. I don't know if that's a continuing program or a one shot, but it might get us over a hump in the near term at least. Anyhow, we need about 3 cents or so a mile in order to cover the existing gas tax. And as we put an MBUF into place, we would start reducing that gas tax. There's a lot of scenarios in between there where other things could happen, fooling with the gas tax. Some people may not want to go to or be able to go to an MBUF program at all, and it might be appropriate to leave some gas tax in there. There's a lot of scenarios could be worked out, a lot of variables anyhow. So anyhow, we have the potential here of raising 13 or 14 billion dollars a year. Not going to be easy. That would push our gas tax or our tolling up to, or mileage fee up to maybe 8 or 9 or 10 cents a mile for a car. So there's a lot to be considered. Tough one. And as I said the other day, the turnpike rate is about on a toll on the turnpikes for an automobile is about 2.6 cents a mile more what we're paying, and everybody thinks that turnpike tolls are high. But that's where we are.
And Ron, I just put a couple of those points that I think you have made, though, talking about the timing, and you've been very realistic that it may be 10 or more years out there.
Yeah, we can talk about it. Yeah, let's go to the next. On timing, this is definitely a phase 3 program. I would think within the next 10 years, some things could happen. I think there would be a number of additional test pilots out there. And I think it would be good to, the Fed's got to be a player in it, but I think we might be able to get the automotive industry, the manufacturers of vehicles, to get involved in what's required to let us drive their cars and their vehicles on the highways. I think there's opportunities to do that sort of thing. I don't think the way the mentality is at this point that there's a push hard enough to put an MBUF into place across the country. A number of states that don't need it. I mean, they got a 22-cent gas tax, and they're funding their highways in a lot of different modes, so they're not anxious to perhaps play in it. But and there's probably a way to put it in place and let some states keep their gas tax. You know, that's all technology, and I think that can happen. But you know, I think Virginia's like 20 cents a mile compared to our 58, and some have a lower. I noticed that some have a lower truck diesel fuel tax than where ours and California's and some others are very high for trucks as well. So the timing, the urgency is on our part is here now, and obviously in a number of other states, and as that urgency gets more severe as fuel consumption goes down in some cases, others are going to want to take bigger steps. Federal coordination, of course, is absolutely necessary. I mean, you know, and there's some resistance on that. I just saw there was no heart in Washington to increase the federal gas tax. I just saw that headline here about a week or so ago. That's concerning, but there's got to be another avenue to do that. And there's resistance on mileage taxes, mileage charges too. But there aren't too many other avenues other than the many pieces that we're putting together to pick up those additional dollars. But federal coordination is absolutely necessary. They're the driver of what getting a standard across all states. We can't do this independently. So there has to be a coalition somehow that pulls that all together. You know, as we go on with this, there's a number of things will happen. Our first goal is to reduce dependence on the fuel tax, and the initial dollars that came from the MBUF would work towards reducing or eliminating the fuel tax. Other things that would change, we're talking about putting charges on EVs. If they started paying an MBUF, the EV would go away. Those charges would go away. Some may not want to, like I say, or be able to go this route, and in that case, they may stay with the gas tax. In the interim, we may be doing some tolling that would go away. If we're putting a mileage tax in, and we've got some tolls on some of the bridges and those places along the roads, those tolls could just drop off. So we're talking about picking up a large part of this $9.3 billion shortfall with this program. You know, there's probably a lot of collection options and processes that need to be developed. A lot of technology to be developed. I think it's so crucial for us, at least, and more so across the entire country, as the utilization of fuels, liquid fuels, go down. That it has to be on the table, has to be part of the program. So we need to be at that table and pushing for those solutions. Can be done, no question. Technology will let us do that. I mean, where we're going to collect it, some people saying, boy, we can still collect it right at the gas pump. Depends on the vehicle that's standing in front and what it's equipped with and what that pump reads. You know, so who knows how we would pay that.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, and you know, we are collecting the information here, but I don't want to try to go into those point by point. But I did want to remind folks that we'll open up the open input. This is for MBUF, and of course, that'll go back to Ron and his team and to all of us after the fact. But Ron, thanks for the encouragement. Thanks for covering that. I'm going to move us on to tolling and invite whoever would like to lead the way. And I have to jump over here for a second and make sure that I advance. There we go. The Mentimeter is open for tolling. We'll pull all that afterward. But Leanne, Mark, I wonder who's covering this one today.
Mark, I didn't know if you wanted to go first or you wanted.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the opportunity, and appreciate the discussion, and also what happened earlier this week with all of the leads getting together. So we had some robust discussion on what was the art of the possible in tolling, and a lot of the things that we talked about really sort of juxtaposed between the 4 programs that are applicable under federal guidelines currently, and also some things about if we were in charge of the federal regs, what we would do. So put this number aside, and the one thing that our group as a tolling entity really talked about is, if ever possible, the idea of statewide tolling is something we believe, to what Ron just spoke of, would be a great opportunity to sort of maybe be the first leg in mileage-based user fees. And we also continued to talk about the understanding that the interstate system here in PA is about 20 years behind the rebuild schedule that the Turnpike started in 2000, and the road's only about 10 years newer than what the Turnpike is. So the Turnpike celebrating 81 years last year gives you a sense of the dire amount of reconstruction that's required. So what we had talked about here was really corridor tolling, and in that talk significantly about, you know, when that rebuild occurs in large corridors on the interstate system, what's the applicability of utilizing this structure. So we talked a lot about just being in Harrisburg and the fact that the 81 corridor would be a good opportunity, potentially from the Maryland line up to Harrisburg or parts of that as it's reconstructed, putting a toll structure in play. And we did differentiate a large part of corridor tolling versus what's a managed lane approach. And the managed lane approach, really from our understanding requires even a higher degree of traffic. And that can be used in probably Pittsburgh, Philadelphia corridor, maybe Allentown. But some of these we think could potentially be longer stretches during the rebuild. So we really use this to target at full build out. It could be 81, could be 79, could be 80, could be 95, and 78. So in that, and this, I saw Bob Latham's question earlier. This is really a rough. In working with some of the deputies at PennDOT, I think this was sort of the middle ground that they gave us as options. So we thought through this that this could be applicable in a long-term strategy once this reaches a fuller build out.
Mark, this one also relates to a comment I made. When you see the jump in numbers between phases 1 and 2, a lot of this certainly would not happen until that phase 2, 3 years out, 4 years out, if for nothing more than the logistics of establishing whatever, the gantries, the mechanisms.
Correct. And maybe even longer term, because when you think about turnpike revenues right now is about 1.4 billion. So this gives you a sense of how many corridors and what that has to be at full build out. And if you put the escalator on at the turnpike schedule at 5-6% for the next couple of years, you get a sense of how long it takes to reach this number. But we do believe it's a viable option for the future.
I will just point out for the group, we also have the managed lanes piece here. So I don't know if Mark wants to cover that and then Leanne do cleanup, or how you want to do that.
Sure. So this really gets into specific congestion areas, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, 95, 476, 376 through Pittsburgh. Some of those areas does require right away. Also, too, it does require value back to the customer. And what we mean by that is you just can't push the congestion down a little farther to get them on the other side of 95. So we do think that there's opportunity. And a lot of times in managed lanes, it's eastbound, east or southbound, one way during peak in the AM, and then the opposite way peak during to work with commuters. So we do think there's options here based on some of our most congested corridors that are peak during high commute times. But as you can see by the numbers there, we don't think it's near the opportunity that we saw on the managed lane or on the corridor side.
And finally, Mark, I'll jump on one more time to say this sets aside and does not incorporate anything that might happen relative to P3, might or might not happen relative to P3 major bridge tolling.
Absolutely.
That's correct. That was, and we really appreciate having the PennDOT executives on the call with us, understanding that those 9 bridges, that's really a one-time payback. So that was none of those numbers were figured back into any of these. And again, these are rough estimates, obviously, but they were not factored into these estimates. Although the group was supportive of the effort, is supportive of the effort.
Leanne?
Sure. Are we switching to another slide? Are we staying here? You just want
I don't have any more for tolling.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if you had anything else.
Yeah, I can keep you dizzy with just 2.
That's okay. That's okay. And to Mark's point, I think part of the important conversation between corridor tolling, managed lanes, and we did discuss, MBUF and various other things, is that these are not, and to Paul's point as well, these are not phase 1 items. And for that purpose, the focus of the corridor, as Mark mentioned, really is about the build out. And really, when we talked as a leadership group on Monday, really trying to wrap our arms around how we came up with these numbers, what did we take into consideration? Just to remind everyone, that focus on the corridor tolling was really looking at it and tying it back to the needs for improvement, whether that's full build out or reconstruction in those areas. So it's not just picking a highway and a section of road and saying, let's toll it. It's really tied back to that. And it has to be, it should be, because that allows those roads to continue to be maintained or rebuilt as needed. One of the other things to point out, and I think Mark started to touch upon this, is especially with the managed lanes, it's really tied to that traffic volume. And I think many of you intellectually understand that with the managed lanes. There are very few places in the state of Pennsylvania. We're not maybe like a larger state that maybe say California, or that has many areas that you could put these in. We don't have large traffic volume areas except for even maybe the 3 Mark mentioned, Pittsburgh, Philly, maybe in Allentown. Could work maybe in some specific areas around Harrisburg. But again, that's why this number, although estimated, is, I call it fairly low. It's still a lot of money, but it's not going to be something that brings in a lot of that revenue, because there are very high levels of limitation of where these can be done and done properly, that it makes sense. And again, to Mark's point and to Paul's, none of this was taken into consideration with the P3 or the major bridge, because that, while we do, as a group, fully approve and feel that needs to be done, these in no way, shape, or form have revenue numbers based on those user fees or what's proposed within that P3 setting.
You have a question there, is congestion pricing part of tolling? Mark might be the best. I think you handled that. Whoops.
Sure. So, and I think we certainly had a little bit of confusion related to congestion tolling that would equate into no excess, no added capacity. So because of that, we narrowly defined congestion pricing, and I'm ready to readily admit that that's not how a lot of people, not all people, define it. But based on the fact that we defined congestion tolling as that of not adding capacity, we shied away from that one. In large part, that was sort of some feedback from PennDOT based on some of the conversations we're having regarding the P3 tolling piece. So I would tell you that I would think congestion pricing is a big part of the second one with managed lanes, and candidly part of the corridor stuff too. It would just add capacity, but you could still have variable toll rates. Especially you'd have variable toll rates in the managed lane scenario at high peak times. It's what you see down in Washington in that corridor to where at peak times, those rates are significantly higher than what it would be at off-peak times.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer. Got a couple of items coming in here for further consideration through the Mentimeter. We're generally not afforded the time today to kind of take them as they come in, but if anything jumps off the screen at you, Mark, you're certainly welcome to.
Paul, this is Rebecca Euler. Is now a good time to chime in? I have some comments on this topic. Go ahead,
please.
Okay, here, I'll turn my video on too so folks can see me. Anyway, I think everyone has heard me talk about our opposition to tolling. I have a real concern here about leaning so heavily on tolling. I was not in this work group, so I didn't contribute to this conversation, but I did want to sort of chime in now. And the group has heard me talk in the past about unintended consequences. I think there's been too little consideration given to the unintended consequences of tolling our interstates here. And obviously the economic impact on the trucking industry would be immense. Our trucking businesses would be uncompetitive with other states, that's for sure. But I also want the group to consider the impact on the manufacturers who rely on multiple supply chain touch points, farmers that deliver their products via interstate, small businesses that are going to directly suffer because they drive as a part of their business, and those that will indirectly suffer through the increased costs in their supply chains. So I think we really need to consider the impact of the businesses, especially in those regional economies, if we're talking about corridor tolling, especially where those tolls are going to be put into place. Those regional economies are going to suffer compared to other parts of the state and to other states as well. And it's really going to be the small businesses that'll be hit the hardest. Those are the ones who suffered the most during the pandemic. And they're also the ones that we, have to give some consideration to now. I think it will impact the state economy as a whole. Tolling will make Pennsylvania businesses less competitive with those in other states. And it will ultimately decrease our tax revenue because businesses will move elsewhere. We know that some of our trucking companies will absolutely move elsewhere, and that business will go out of state. And when we talk about the regions, I think we have to absolutely consider the impact on the secondary roads. that weren't intended to handle interstate traffic. We know there will be diversions, and that will impose costs on local municipalities for law enforcement and infrastructure, even safety. We know that accident rates are higher on those roads too. So I really do think that we need to give some consideration to those unintended consequences. They're going to have a huge impact on state and local economies, and I can't support this recommendation. I also think that you do need to consider the bridge tolling project and how that will interact with some of these other options for interstate tolling. Those bridge tolling projects are slated at this point to be around for 30 years. So I think that you do need to consider where those bridges are being tolled vis-a-vis where these other tolling projects are going to be implemented. And congestion tolling, I know I mentioned this before, but a lot of folks can't control when they travel on interstates, including truckers, but also commuters. So that is going to affect some people, and especially people who need to travel to get to their jobs at certain times and maybe on the lower side of the income scale. So that has to be a consideration as well. So I just wanted to point out some of those unintended consequences.
Thanks, Rebecca. That is indeed why we're here. Yeah. Excellent. I'm going to move us to the fees group. I don't know if anyone from the fees leadership group is available to address these. That may not be the case right now, and I can certainly cover it as we did last time around. Does anyone else want to jump in? Excellent. So as it stands, most of the groups submitted a vehicle registration fee of some $750 million. That represents a 100% increase in that. Now, how one would phase into that and so forth would have to be worked out. I want to point out, and you'll see it under other, that would be offset should there be an ad valorem tax introduced. So that would be offset. Half of that for the passenger vehicles would be offset. So they're not going to be added up. And in the numbers I showed you before, that had been taken into account. That's obviously the big one. The others are not insignificant either. However, a vehicle lease fee is currently sitting there at a $67 million. A TNC, our Uber Lyft folks, at $200 million, and a vehicle rental fee of some $120 million. So that's kind of the big picture on that scale of the fees side. I'm going to just pop over here and make sure I keep my Mentimeter up to date with which topic we are on. Thank you. Moving into some smaller numbers, but as has been pointed out, not insignificant, the electric car fee. That if an electric car comes onto the highway, uses the highway as much as any other car does, and perhaps more, and pays nothing for the use of that highway via the gas tax, well, that doesn't seem right. So while this doesn't look like a big number, this is obviously something that would grow over time, both with the increase in numbers of electric cars. And really, I think the numbers are at this point just kind of notional, but that there would be some electric car fee. We're only showing $1.5 million, but again, small scale to become ultimately very large scale, especially based on some recent announcements by the big automakers. Not to be forgotten, an aircraft registration fee. The total there is on the order of $300,000, perhaps tying back to the kind of everyone pays a fair share of that. So I can pause there and see if there are comments on the fees. Either from the
Could I ask, what is the per trip user fee for Uber and Lyft and limousine type carriage that is in that number?
One of our number crunchers, Chuck, I will put you on the spot, but do you remember the, I'm thinking it might be Chuck, do you remember the numbers that multiplied out to that?
Yeah, trying to look right now. I think it was either $1 or $2, and we're still trying to get information on taxis. Nate from my office has been in contact, and I think we have some information there, just trying to verify it. But I think the ultimate, I'm trying to look here. I think it was set at $2, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, because our team with Dan, we dealt with this as well. And I think we came up with $1, but I'm not sure. It might have even been 75 cents. But I think this number has to be given staff attention by DOT in terms of what kind of numbers we're going to really deal with, because I think this is not a small number, although compared to some of the other numbers, it's a rounding error. But I do think that we're going to see an increase, particularly in the cities, in this kind of traffic. And I just want to make sure that our underlying assumptions of the estimates are reasonable and not beyond the pale. I for one think $2 is a big number, but I voiced that in our group. I just want to make sure that this number is defensible, because you can be sure it will be attacked.
And I did find the number. If it's not applied to taxis, to get to 200 million is $2.22. I think the thought was, once we get a good number on taxis, we'll incorporate that in, which will bring that $2.22 down significantly. And like I said, we're working on that. So very good point. Yes.
Thank you, Chuck. Quick research there for us. And Howard, thank you for your sharp eye on that. And it just popped up. Not a lot coming in on the input on fees. A couple of notes here. Yeah, kind of a general point there as well. Thank you. I'm going to advance the Mentimeter. I always say, don't worry about where you put something. We can sort it out later. We're trained to discern where the different pieces belong. So that takes us into just this one big picture item I have on taxes, and then I have the bulleted items for you, Secretary Hassel and or your team.
Sure. So let me start. The big number here is vehicle sales tax, and that is the number that's related to a 1.93% rate increase on vehicles. This does not pull in any additional general fund money into the motor license fund. But this additional rate of almost 2% would be dedicated revenue that would be transferred over to support roads and bridges. So that's where that landed. The gas tax number that's here is for putting in place an inflation adjustment in the current fuel tax. As long as that exists, then this would at least allow the revenue base to grow a little, to keep it from falling farther behind until the MBUF comes online. And when it does, when the transition to the MBUF is complete, then this would go away along with the gas tax. And then the last item there is the tax on jet fuel. I believe this correlates to a 2.8 cents per gallon tax, if I'm not mistaken. But that would be dedicated revenue for airports, I believe.
In fact, Bob Schaefer, you may care to comment on that. And Secretary Hassel, I don't know if you have control of your microphone, but it does come across a bit strong. Thank you.
Yes, Paul, I would. And thank you, Secretary Hassel, for introducing that. I believe it's only 2 cents. We have a 2 cent tax on jet fuel that was implemented back in the early 80s under separate legislation dedicated to, as you suggested, airports and supporting those airports and projects and across the Commonwealth. And so what we were suggesting in the overall infrastructure here is to increase that by 2 cents. Today it generally, in a round number, generates at 10 million, and we look for an additional 10 million with the new 2 cents.
And this is Chuck here. Just to clarify on that, the current rate fluctuates from 1.5 to 2 cents. It's currently at 1.5 because of the calculation in the legislation. So what I did there was assume we're at the 2%, then added 2%. So, or I'm sorry, 2 cents. So it would suggesting a 4-cent flat amount, so we don't have that fluctuation. That's why it's 10 million instead of 8, which I think you had provided.
Yeah,
Thank you.
excellent. So I have a second slide, which is actually to say you don't see bars for these. So back to you, Secretary Hassel, if you like, or I can cover it. But
just very quickly, the main sources of revenue for the general fund, the corporate net income tax, personal income tax, sales tax, and realty transfer are not incorporated here, other than the piece that I identified for vehicle sales tax. And in my group, the discussion about this was that these are things that are not related to transportation needs, and so we shouldn't go there.
we have the Mentimeter open. Of course, we have chat open. This is one of those circumstances where we start to characterize what the proposal will look like. And so if you were taking a very broad brush approach, you'd say, this is not a high tax or an increased tax proposal. This is a proposal that seeks to aim its revenue generation at users and perhaps, Secretary, beneficiaries of the system, of the infrastructure. So by all means, if you feel otherwise, we need to hear about that as well. But this is starting to take shape and kind of get anchored into the way the funding proposal and ultimately the final report will take shape. So. Also, I noted, Nolan, just a nuance or just one of those things out on the landscape. There is a TNC in place that helps support Philadelphia schools. Good to know. I don't know that that came up in the work group's discussion of it, but there may be other things like that when, ultimately when all the stones are, turned, we find out that there are other complexities. So great point. We appreciate it. I'll just pop over and see if there's anything we need to deal with right along here. We will hit the ad valorem, and your comment is well taken in either respect. Jet fuel tax seems modest, even to catch up.
Ron Drunovich, I agree with leaving those items out of the plan here. But we've had a couple of comments come through in today's discussion. Everything that we are proposing to do in any one of these areas is going to impact lives, businesses, people, and it's crucial. I agree with Dan Hassel's initial comments. Every one of these that we develop, when they, if in fact get adopted somewhere, need to have a component that really addresses the impacts socially and economically on those in need and to minimize that impact. And all of them things can be done to lessen those impacts and in some cases eliminate them. The changes will be necessary. The opportunities are immense to do it right. And so we shouldn't shy away from any of them because of the impacts they cause, but we need to know what they are, address them, and it almost ought to be a caveat in what we finally present that each one of these, as they are implemented, has a very solid component on addressing the inequality that might occur because of the impacts.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate that. The PSP funding number is maintained in this, as I pointed out when we did the sort of aggregate look at the 673 million full turn back. That is developing as we speak. I don't know. I will certainly advance the Mentimeter. We may not have complete control over this right now, but this is something in play. So we probably don't have to spend a great deal of time on it. I will note that the groups generally looking at this suggested a fairly rapid turnover and also a lot of sensitivity to the replenishing of that through the general fund, and there are various mechanisms proposed for that. So certainly, Bob, I see your situation lighted up there for me. Your little box lighted up.
Sure, thanks. I mean, we've, our group, in the brief discussions, I guess, or conversations that we've had, I think you characterized it pretty well. The issue is, this is a lot of money coming out of the motor license fund. It's 11 cents a gallon currently, the equivalent of our 50-some cents per gallon equivalent gas tax. And there is some discussion about taking that down, at least in this budget year. But I think that, if we're looking for revenue options going forward that are tied with a nexus towards transportation, I think reducing this in some significant fashion is something that should remain on our table. I'd say when this group gets back together again at its next meeting, we'll have a more clear picture as to where things stand.
Indeed. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. I'm going to move us on to other. Now, this slide is the first time I've put up a revenue projection that goes in the wrong direction, but fear not. This is a reflection on the right side that if the ad valorem vehicle tax is adopted, that's the big bar on the left, and it's shown here in the same amount as the vehicle registration fee. If indeed this were adopted instead, then it would be adopted for passenger vehicles. Therefore, half of it would go away. So half of the registration income, if you will, the registration revenue would go away. Just trying to keep the books balanced by showing this. The more important point is philosophical, that this ad valorem vehicle tax is predicated on the sense that it's based upon ability to pay. And then there is a Pennsylvania Turnpike funding connection here as well that has been put on the table. And then the MBUF pilot, because that's really kind of in the other, that's electric vehicle MBUF. So just to cover the MBUF, the 1.5 million we saw earlier for electric vehicle registration and the 2 million would add to 3.5, getting the ball rolling on electric vehicle revenues. The big numbers here happen to be on the ad valorem side, and just kind of the discussion has to be, is that an appropriate mechanism by which to fund the infrastructure as seen by members of the commission? So the Mentimeter's open, the chat's open, and you can unmute and open up and speak with us if you'd like to talk about that at all. There's no other group per se, so I had the honors of handling that. But this is where things have settled. Ad valorem in particular, people's sense of that would be good to know. And we can certainly carry it forward in this fashion, and kind of keeping an eye. I'll pop up over to see if there's anything coming in. So yeah. So
Paul, can I ask a question?
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you clarify what's envisioned here? You said something about the impact of the ad valorem tax on individuals will be offset with a fee reduction. Does that imply there's no offset on the commercial vehicle side?
I believe that is how it has been construed thus far. I'm pretty sure that's the way that has been at the passenger vehicle side, whereas the number is otherwise still showing an increase, as formerly on the commercial vehicle side, Secretary Hassel.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and I do appreciate this is not insignificant. The items that are coming in through Mentimeter, we really are trying to find our way here. What's an appropriate way for this commission to speak of how infrastructure, transportation infrastructure is funded? So this is quite helpful to understand people's perspective on this. What we'd like to do is come back at the first meeting of July and say, here's how it looks like everything is shaped up. So we're taking these into very serious account and analyzing them. Somebody brings up the CNG vehicles, the sort of, another vying technology for powering these things we get around in. Thank you. All right. Leave that one open for a moment. We're going to step forward with another, if you will. So I'll leave that open. We're not seeing in this sort of developing, emerging picture of options, a significant piece from legalized marijuana, proceeds from gambling. We're not discounting the American Rescue Plan, and it may well have value. It's not shown in this revenue options proposal. So that too is certainly worthy of any comment folks would like to put in there. You can continue in Mentimeter for that as well. We did get a question concerning the status of studies on the P3, on the diversions of traffic, local impacts and so forth. Thank you, Nolan. I'm certainly not authorized or able to comment on that. We can follow up unless somebody happens to have an idea of a kind of a status update on the sort of secondary impacts, which are primary impacts of the people affected. Understood.
Yeah, Paul, it's Ken McLean from PennDOT. I can answer Nolan's question.
Thanks, Ken.
And follow up a little bit on Rebecca Euler's comments. Rebecca brings up a lot of good points in her commentary as it relates to toll diversions and impacts along secondary roadway networks. PennDOT is currently in the process of finalizing the diversionary analyses. There are analyses at each of these 9 candidate bridges. We do realize that there will be diversions, certain percentages of people that will divert against paying a toll and be utilizing secondary roadway networks. So we're coming to the end of our draft analyses. We're actually in the process right now of scheduling diversionary workshops in each of the communities for each of these 9 candidate bridges. Those workshops will include, local chambers of commerce, key employers, local communities, public works directors, PennDOT, county maintenance managers, and other traffic engineering staff, where we will present rough findings and gather additional input from the local level to those community leaders that are most knowledgeable about the infrastructure in and around their communities. So those are getting scheduled. Those will be done prior to going out to the public as it relates to actual public meetings as mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act. So we are taking Rebecca's comments very, very seriously. There will be impacts. We're in the process of quantifying them, and then ultimately we will be mitigating those impacts. So 2 forms of mitigations relating to diversions, one of which would be, capacity impacts. If local roadway networks do, if the levels of service tend to degrade, we will be, doing signal retiming projects and other types of initiatives to try to account for those degradations in capacity on those secondary routes. And then we're also going to be doing highway safety manual studies that are going to try to quantify modeling of safety impacts to those roadways. So oftentimes when there are increases of traffic, there is a higher likelihood of safety issues. So we are doing modeling efforts to try to quantify those. And then there could be safety mitigation issues and projects that spin out of this project as well. And those are all types of infrastructure improvements that can be and will be paid for with the use of those toll revenue dollars at those 9 candidate bridges. Rebecca made another point about impacts to low income people that may commute. So we do have to look at particular environmental justice issues relating to low-income minority populations. We're trying to figure out exactly what the economic bands of people are residing in and around those areas, utilizing those bridges. And if there is undue impact to certain demographics of people, we will be putting strategies together to help mitigate those economic impacts to those demographic of Pennsylvanians that will be impacted most. So just a rough update. We're knee deep into it, and we're getting ready to go out for workshops.
I should just add, as a former member of P3, Ken and the staff are deep into the issues, as he mentioned, and he's quite correct that the consideration of the bridge tolling project would include using those revenues for to mitigate, to use his words, the costs, and that would include if small businesses were hurt along the way. One of the things that was looked at or was going to be looked at, and I'm sure it has been looked at, is if you have a business that has to use the bridge on a very regular basis, or a parent who has to take their kid to school on a regular basis, there are ways using the tolling mechanisms and modern electronics and algorithms that could take into account those costs and mitigate the harms and repay those who are harmed in one way or another. And the PennDOT staff is really on those issues. And I frankly think, from what I've seen, they're doing a terrific job.
Yeah, there's one other point that I want to make as well, and that is, you know, we're paying very close attention to infrastructure all over the country, and we've got an aged infrastructure system here in Pennsylvania. The interstates are over 60 years of age, as Mark Compton alluded to during his presentation. The cost of doing nothing with some of these major bridges is quite significant to local economies, quite significant to stakeholders that utilize those interstates to move goods, such as the trucking industry. I just read an article last week that most recently there was a long-term closure of the Interstate 40 bridge over the Mississippi River in Tennessee, and the trucking industry is paying $2.4 million per day as a result of that bridge closure. That's going to have a significant impact on that industry and the local businesses in and around that bridge. So, you know, those are the types of things that we cannot afford to have happen on the interstates in Pennsylvania. And, you know, that's why we need a significant investment in these major infrastructure pieces to avoid those issues. So I just wanted to bring that up. That was an article I read just last week.
Thank you, Ken. Excellent. Actually, some of those local impacts were an excellent segue into the last of our focal areas here, that of local solutions. I scanned there, and I believe Amy has joined us. Amy had a busy day. Are you with us, Amy?
In mind, body, and spirit, yes.
And voice, even better.
And a voice. And that's a good segue into the conversations that the local solutions work group has been wrestling with, because the challenge that we're facing at the local level that you just heard of, the diversionary routes, is the conversation that we're having related to funding does not have the appropriate scale and to the extent of the local needs, because the local infrastructure is not part of that $9 billion figure. And I think it's the biggest challenge that we're having is coming up with revenue that not only helps close the $9 billion gap, but also affords the opportunity for local officials to have the options to generate the revenue that they're going to need on local assets that are going to be impacted by diversion vehicles or growth in their communities, and how to address those. So, you know, we've talked about the unique challenges that our communities have. Many of our rural communities at even a greater disadvantage. You know, we talked a little bit in our area about, at least in our region, most of our properties are owned by state and federal government, and they pay in lieu of taxes and generate a lot of tourism and recreation. And how do they handle that demand, and what tools do they have in place to generate revenue to support the infrastructure needs that they have? We really look closely at, you know, the sales tax opportunity at a county and or regional level, and you know, will the counties be willing to put that in their toolbox as a revenue source, and is there legislative action that needs to be taken to allow that to happen at a regional level, to generate funding. We've talked a little bit about, you know, everybody benefiting from a transportation system, but again, we fund transportation in all modes primarily through the sale of gas tax. If the gas tax goes away, how do we fund other modes of transportation, and how do we support, you know, the equity issue of those who just can't afford to pay for transportation, don't own a vehicle, but how do we make sure that we're addressing the needs that they may have? And we talked a little bit last time about, you know, everybody benefits from good transportation. Do we look at a per capita type concept to pay for it, and what type of revenue does that generate? And I think that, you know, Keith and Paul, if you want to talk a little bit about that, we can dive into it. The other piece is we have a lot of assets that we need to maintain, and is there redundancy in those assets? Do we need to go and look at just getting rid of local or state assets that are no longer used, that were built 75, 100 years ago, and don't make the assumption that we have to take them? Or do we go back to the turn back program and we pass that on to the state assets, on to the local governments? What do they do? How do they maintain it? These are all things that we wrestled with, but at the end of the day, really what we're looking at is modal flexibility, generating enough revenue to deal with the state issues, to address the local issues, and to invest in multimodal transportation, regardless of that ownership.
Thank you so much, Amy. Dave, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to Amy's excellent presentation. Dave, we're not hearing you. You don't seem to be muted, but we're not hearing you. Just very faintly.
If I switch.
Pilot to co-pilot. There you go.
There we go. Maybe that'll work better.
That's good.
I would just add that as we talk about, and I know most of our discussion has been about revenue enhancements, but it would be remiss if we didn't talk about the opportunities for cost savings and mandate relief that would allow existing revenues and even new revenues to go even further. So to have that as part of a discussion overall.
And Dave, that mandate relief is both state and federal, if I understand it. There are those mandates hitting the locals.
Yes,
2,562 of them, right?
Yeah, and in many instances hitting PennDOT as well. So when they're federal, so I mean, there may be ways that existing dollars that are being spent unnecessarily that can be redirected into pushing more projects further along.
Excellent point, Dave.
Yeah, and Paul, we talked a lot about the shipping and handling, you know, that we all understand that packages are being delivered free shipping. You know, the brown smiley box shows up at everybody's door and it says free shipping, but we know that's not true, and really wrestled with how to get back to having people understand that we need to be paying for that first and last mile local delivery that is no longer UPS or the postal service delivering your mail, but is, you know, the box trucks that are coming multiple times a day in some cases to deliver said box.
Well, Amy, my appreciation goes out to you because you're keeping me on track. The first of our briefings deals with that directly. Go ahead, Dave.
Could I just jump in? I just saw one of the things on the Mentimeter question was what prevents local governments from just taxing or putting fees on roads or bridges to maintain them? And the short answer to that is the legislature. And that the local governments do not have the authority to impose any taxes beyond a property tax, or in some instances a local income tax. So most of the local government support for roads and bridges is covered by property taxes, and any shortfalls will result in local property tax increases.
Thanks, Dave. You got a sharp eye on that. I appreciate your catching that. So I will open up Mentimeter on package delivery as well. Amy kind of did the introduction for us. I did an earlier introduction, and you've already met Jenny. So Jenny, you're on.
Awesome. Let's see. Do I have the ability to
advance my slides here?
You do not. I mean, with this number of slides, we didn't get into that. I'll
Okay.
advance them for you. So.
All right, go ahead and flip over then, Paul.
Once you've seen
if
your
you
own
would.
picture and recognized it, I can move you on.
That's my cue. So just briefly, again, this has come up again a couple times over through this group. I have heard Mr. Latham. He actually had an intern that did a little bit of research on the feasibility of this. And I've actually also had some discussions with Senator Kearney's office. This has been brought to the department's attention, and I know there's been a lot of, again, different analysis, different methodologies to advance this concept. Again, we kind of loosely refer to it as a package tax or fee. Some people call it a convenience fee. So it's been labeled a number of things. So we're going to talk briefly about that. Where is it being considered other than the Commonwealth and what we're talking about here? How much money could it potentially generate? And then we have a lot of policy considerations. Secretary Hassel, I know, has conveyed some of them to a lot of members of the group. We'll mention those, plus a couple other ones that, again, I've heard from numerous different individuals. So with that, Paul, so I kind of, that was my segue into that. So what we have looked at and the information we have gathered from others, today we're just going to talk about a flat fee. So there was some discussion about like a percentage, a sales tax kind of fee, but that seemed to create greater angst and greater challenges. Not to say that it still couldn't be considered, but and I think Secretary Hassel, you I think had indicated that a flat fee per box might be more acceptable, also from a constitutionality perspective.
Yes,
So,
that's correct.
Wonderful. So a lot of folks feel that it not only addresses the impact that my unholy love of Amazon Prime puts on the transportation network, but also the environment. Because I think for those of you, you know, that order on Amazon Prime, you'll see you get a choice. Oh, you could have it tomorrow on Wednesday, or do you want to save? You want to save this and we'll ship it on Saturday, just in case tomorrow morning you decide you want to order something else. And I hate to admit this, but I don't generally defer till Saturday, because whatever it is, I think I need it immediately. So in 2019, just some statistics. Again, this helps put it in perspective when we talk about what it could potentially generate. In 2019, as you can see, we looked at 14.7 billion parcels. Of that, again, we don't have statistics exactly down to the package numbers, but based upon you know, the GDP, these percentages, they pretty much vet out, give or take probably, you know, 1 million or so. You'll see the number significantly increased in 2020, and I'm sure in 2021. I believe that trend is continuing. So even though we're out of quarantine, I will tell you that I love having my groceries delivered. Now that is not part of this, but I think it's reflective of a lot of change in thinking on, do I really need to run to the store, or can I just get online and order it and have it dropped off at my house? Even if it's not Prime, even if it shows up in a week, what's that dynamic? So again, we're looking at a significant volume. So again, just keep those kind of numbers in the back of your head as we go forward. So Paul, you want to flip? So where else are we looking at this? So again, and I have articles and links. If anybody in the commission is interested in more of this information, I can definitely forward it to you. So New York City, they have been proposing a $3 a box fee. And the monies that would be raised from that would go to transit, to MTA. So I think based upon a lot of the communications that I've read about their pursuit with their General Assembly, it would, again, in the short term, the transit agencies are, I think, okay with the federal relief money that they've either gotten through CARES Act or CRISI or ARPA, but they're looking at long term. When that money runs out, how do they fund transit going forward? So Colorado, the fee is, again, much less, but it's statewide. And again, I believe from everything I've read, they weren't just earmarking for transit, they were looking at the highways. Again, how could that money be divided out? And much like any kind of new legislation, neither one of these has passed yet, but they are out there. So it's not, I'd like to always believe we're innovative and new and forward thinking in Pennsylvania, and I think we are. But again, we have two kind of case studies that we're looking at also to see where that's going. And I know Mr. Latham had been, again, Bob has been incredibly helpful with helping me track down information on different avenues. All right, so let's talk about what kind of funding are we looking at? So there was scenario planning that was done. Again, a quarter, a package, 50 cents, 75 cents, and $1, right? And I just use the term loosely box. So don't get too hung up on that per se. We'll talk a little bit about some of the policy considerations, and I think that's really the devil's in the details. So we'll get to that on the next slide. But just for everybody's benefit, let's just skip to the bottom of the slide, right? So if we just look at collectively, right, what those various amounts are on any given year, you're looking at 200 million to close to $1 billion, right? And I think even if you just propose the quarter, that 200 to $250 million that you would be looking at is all cash revenue. It could be bonded if it went to the highway. It could be bonded if it went to transit agencies. It could be used for any kind of mode, depending upon how the legislation and the policy parameters were set up. And again, if you look at just general projections and growth rates that are consistent with what we've seen historically, I think that kind of gives you, again, a perspective. So does it solve every transportation problem we have? No, absolutely not. But again, I think if some of the policy considerations and again, all the key principles can be addressed, I think this could be a significant funding source, whether it was for transit or freight or highways or local roadway networks, whichever mode or all of those modes, plus, aviation. Let's not forget our other friendly sources and multimodal. I think, these are some significant dollars going forward. And the Secretary mentioned in her opening comments, the difference between user fees and those that are beneficiaries. And really, I will tell you, every day that I get home from work and I see as Amy mentioned, the smiley box on my front porch, I am truly a beneficiary of the transportation network, because I go to work and I come home, and honestly, I don't have to then go to Walmart or to the mall and pick up whatever that birthday gift is for my niece and move forward. So let's, Paul, go to the next slide, because this is really where the conversation, I think, goes forward. So what are the policy considerations, right? So if this kind of initiative goes forward, whether it's a quarter, 50 cents, whatever the amount is, how is that money allocated, right? So again, when you look at Colorado, the discussions were showing that they were thinking they would divide it up amongst several modes. MTA and New York City were thinking it's going strictly to transit. Again, that was kind of the dynamic. Some of the questions and concerns I've heard from people is, So if it's going to be collected, like charged to the person, so charged to me, I live in Lancaster County. So, you know, that much like sales tax is kind of tracked. And then, you know, does a percentage of that total pot get distributed locally for local transportation improvements? And, you know, are those local transportation improvements transit oriented? Are they freight? You know, are they strictly highway and bridge? How does that work? Exemptions. So one thing I will say, I know New York City had proposed to exempt food shipments and prescriptions. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at my notes on Colorado. But again, and I think Secretary Hassel, you had a lot of questions too, like this, if I order a couch, does that also, you know, depending on who drops it off, I think there's a lot of, again, devil is in the details kind of questions that if this looks like it might be feasible, how do we go forward? Again, I put on there the confirm the ability to implement, because again, I know that had been a concern. How does it match up with the Constitution and interstate commerce going forward? And I'm looking at, I know again, there's a lot of questions, right? Like, does it apply to a box over a certain size? Is it a padded envelope? What does that look like? So again, with this, there are really a lot of policy considerations that would need to be fully vetted, you know, against the priorities and the prioritization things, and working with the General Assembly to make this a reality. So with that, Paul, I think the next one is my question slide.
It is, and I'll pop up. Some of them might be in here, Jenny. You're so economical with time that if there's anything here you want to jump into, none of them are super short. So you have to do a quick read, or perhaps Secretary Hassel has color commentary on that.
I think you've done a great job on the presentation. I don't want to get in the way. Just one, you know, because we deal with this all the time, I just want to make note of the fact that exemptions, like in sales tax, can make a huge difference in revenue. So that as you work through a proposal, inevitably people are going to start saying, well, it shouldn't apply to prescriptions. Maybe it also shouldn't apply to any deliveries to nonprofits, to schools, to hospitals, to religious institutions, those kind of things. And as you said, the devil's in the details. So that can make a big difference.
And again, I mentioned Senator Kearney's office and Bob Latham and APC. I want to give them both a big shout out. They were incredibly helpful in, again, providing information they had already gathered and pointing me in the right direction. So Bob, I think you were on, sorry, my screen's pretty small. But if there's anything I missed, please don't hesitate to chime in. But again, there's been a lot of different people I've talked to about this. So, you know, I don't have all the answers. And I think, again, the concept definitely illustrates that there's the potential for a nice chunk of revenue to support transportation. And I think, again, as a beneficiary user, right? I'm not a direct user because UPS or FedEx or whoever's dropping that package off at my house, you know, I sort of vetted this through the weekend cookout, you know, with family members. Like I said, hey, you know, how would you guys feel if you had to pay a quarter, like assessment, like your bill on Amazon was $10 and, you know, a quarter got added to the end. And I will say that for the most part, people were like, so it's going to go to transportation. And I think, you know, nobody ever likes to pay more for anything, but I think it was not as, like, my family members, and we don't usually agree on a whole heck of a lot, they generally agreed they'd probably be okay with it. So not that my family should be the bar for expectations, but just, you know, it's an interesting family conversation, right?
Yeah,
Instead of me getting hammered on the gas tax all the time. I said, well, how do you feel about this? So.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Jen, you did a great job, I think, in introducing the subject and covering it very well. I think that just a couple of things I'll add is the original concept came from the current air freight excise tax, so that if you ship something by air, there is an actual air freight excise tax. A couple of years ago, the American Road and Transportation Builders Association started to flesh out something along this lines. And so we appreciate the opportunity to work with you and some others in putting this on the table. There's a lot of things that you know, this cake hasn't been baked yet. There's a lot of things that have to be brought forward. But I think the other thing that to keep in mind is there's a lot of discussion now with the absolute explosion of warehousing along our interstate highway system. It doesn't seem too long ago that when you left Harrisburg and drove either north or south on Interstate 81, you were looking at farmland. Now you're looking at 1 million, 2 million square foot warehouse, one right after the other. And you know, there's a reason they're there, you know, and the things that go in and out of there obviously do that on Interstate 81, and there's a associated stress there. There's also an associated stress with local governments. So, you know, I think that there's certainly a discussion here that anything generated here might need to be shared with local government. So, yeah, I thought that your presentation was very good. Thanks.
So, Mr. Compton, are you still on the phone? And I think this ties, in my mind, to potential tax or package taxes, like commercial traffic. How do you? I don't know. Sorry, this is a very technical question, I guess, or detailed. But what's the turnpike seeing with that kind of movement on the turnpike? Like,
first of all, Jen, you know I never miss your presentation, so of course I'm here.
I don't think you want to miss our barbecues either, Mark. I'm going to set up a Mentimeter at the next one if I'm invited. So.
Yep.
That's a great question. And to your point, so up over 2019 numbers, we're up about 4.5% to 5% on all commercial traffic. So that's classifications from 2 to 9, which is anything above a passenger vehicle. So that's candidly that's saving us right now. And that would mean 2019 numbers and all traffic was a record number. So on the commercial side, up being 4.5% or so, that's really a record for us. And the growth we're seeing is a lot of those mid-size commercial vehicles, which we attribute to sort of the Amazon phenomenon, which is, you know, those mid-size box trucks. And to your point, you know, stuff like Giant running groceries throughout the mid-state. So yeah, that has been a big boom for us. And, you know, the turnpike benefits from that because we're trip-based collection. But the rest of the Commonwealth really doesn't, based on the fact that they're not collecting tolls. So yeah, that's a great question, and we have seen benefit, and candidly through the pandemic, that's what's kept us afloat.
Jen, we got a lot of good feedback that we can sort through after the fact. I do want to make sure we allow a little time for Mike to do his talk on the maintenance side of things. Excellent job. Thank you. All right, with that, we're going to jump over. And I'll advance the Mentimeter first and the PowerPoint second. And when you see yourself, it's your time to talk.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And good afternoon, everyone.
All good.
I will just two quick follow-ups. First of all, I like to let Jen know that, again, today the Kaiser household would contribute to the package delivery ideas we just spoke about. I think we're at 3 right now, but it's still early in the day, so I could go to 4
I'll tell you what, Mike, I'll swing by your house tonight. I'll have my coffee can and you can just drop your 75 cents in there.
Yeah, I'll keep a weekly tab and let you know, Jen.
Okay,
so,
good.
And then just to follow up, to go back to where we were in the beginning of our session today, Keith talked about inflation. And I do have one slide, I'll talk about that, but in terms of Act 89, you know, we've talked about this internally, maybe talked about a little bit with T-Rock. We were really hopeful that the switching over to the wholesale tax would kind of level set for inflation. However, again, it's you know, a little bit of a long time ago, back in 2013, the price of gas was actually higher than it is today. So in reality, that didn't pan out for us in terms of inflation. Now Georgia, you know, anytime you have a good idea, you know, people use your good ideas, and Georgia, from what I understand, has taken essentially our Act 89 legislation, but they did index that against their actual inflation numbers. So there's a correction there each year based on how the economy's doing. And the only other thing I wanted to add quickly is, even though gas prices are higher right now, PennDOT is not receiving any additional revenues. I'll kind of let the math to our champion Chuck Zimmerman, but from what I understand, it has to go above $4 a gallon, and it has to stay there for a year before PennDOT would receive any revenue. So good to tell your friends that, hey, you're paying more for gas, but it's not adding to transportation right now. So again, Paul, just wanted to kind of close the loop on that. Opportunity today to talk about funding and maintenance. And again, there's a big number here. It's about $1.34 billion a year that we spend on maintenance in Pennsylvania. That's funded through the Motor License Fund. What may be of surprise to a lot of folks from outside of our partners and industry here is this number really has been fixed since 05-06. That's our state fiscal year, July to June. And the presentation today, just to make sure everyone understands, I've actually using data from 2018, 2019. The reason I'm doing that is the 2019, 2020 data, of course, we started to take a hit from COVID-19 and kind of continued into the next state fiscal year. So the 2018, 2019 is kind of the last level set normal year we had in terms of revenues and maintenance. So now what does that $1.3 billion do? Again, we're going to get into that as we go through the slides here, but it does address all maintenance activities across the Commonwealth, all 67 counties, critical work that we do, and support activities that go with that. So I'm going to provide a breakdown of these expenses and maybe just drill into those just at a high level so everyone understands what they are. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices and efficiencies, because there's no way we can continue to do what we were doing from 05-06 with no increases of money. So again, we have been using best practices and efficiencies. So you go to the next slide. This will be the telling tell here. Again, this is breaking down at 1.34 billion. And you can see a big percentage of that, 49%, goes to payroll and benefits. There has to be some way that the Commonwealth pays the employees, and this is where that money comes from. And it obviously includes all of our county folks, you know, anyone that's involved with maintenance. So some of our operations, you know, BOMO and things like that, Bureau of Maintenance Operations. I try not to use the acronyms, but the one exception to that would be our folks in project delivery, where we actually have projects set up that we can charge to those projects. But again, just like we've learned through this whole process, those costs are actually fronted first with state dollars, and then maybe there's an opportunity to get some of those back with federal. But again, the bulk of our employees of PennDOT are paid out of this 1.34 billion. So from there, you go to our operations. That's about 37%, or I think just a tad under 500 million there. And then talk a little bit about facilities. That's about 5%, you know, just the cost of doing operations, just like you would with your home. About 3% goes into equipment. These numbers, by the way, are rounded off because you know, PowerPoint wants to make sure all these numbers add up to 100%, which is always good. And then we have about 2% that goes to central office and 4% that goes to the 11 different districts. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start to, again, you really don't have to talk about the benefits and the salaries. That's self-explanatory. Yeah, here's kind of what we're talking about for our operations. Obviously, number one is winter services. You've seen our numbers published on that. Talk about some core maintenance activities. These are the bare minimums that we like to do out there with maintenance. Of course, drainage, shoulder cutting, some patching, crack sealing, bridge washing is very important in terms of extending the life of those assets. We have to do mowing and brush clearing. People don't really think about that a whole lot, but if you get heavy, dense vegetation along the highways, if you're not careful, you're signing and that's going to get covered up, and it could lead to some other issues. Of course, roadway signing. Again, if you just think about the number of signs that are along our roadway, we're on a cycle, I believe it's about 17 years or so, where we try to redo those signs. That's probably longer than most people would think. And then a real important product that we have out there, of course, is our line painting. In addition to that, we have some garage costs. I think they're self-explanatory. Again, don't forget, we have to buy fuel for all of our vehicles, so there's a cost there, and also a cost of materials, which have a little bit more detailed information on that later. We go to the next slide. Again, this is just the general upkeep of our facilities. Predominantly, again, those first three on the top here are what really where bulk of this funding goes. But of course, we have repair and maintenance of our facilities. So what's our facilities? Well, every county maintenance office, we have 67 of those. We have our rest areas, we have our welcome centers, we have our stockpiles. We are a pretty big operation that spreads across the entire Commonwealth. And all those buildings have utility expenses, again, just like you do in your own home. So you have your electric bills. By the way, that also extends to highway lighting on our interstate, which is 100% PennDOT. We have some agreements that share that cost on some of our lower network. And then again, some other things here that really wouldn't surprise anybody, but office supplies, some facilities we don't own, so there's some rental associated with that. So again, that's really just kind of paying your bill, so to speak. So the next one here is equipment, I believe, if we get into that next slide there, Paul. Again, we do have our fleet management division, which kind of manages this from top down, kind of keeps everyone working off the same sheet of music, so to speak. And the equipment expenditures, again, we could make a very good argument that we're underfunding that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But our core equipment, clearly with PennDOT, are our dump trucks, our crew cabs, and then the loaders. And to put a little bit of a number on here, I'll talk about a tandem dump truck that's generally around $205,000 for a brand new truck, about $15,000 a year to maintain. If you jump into a triaxle, the bigger trucks that perhaps we would use on the interstates, those costs can jump up to about $226,000 a year, a unit. Again, you have the maintenance that goes with that. Crew cabs, again, I'm sure everyone's familiar with those, but probably around $75,000 to $80,000 a crew cab. We're doing some things with those of, again, four-wheel drive. The value of this equipment when we sell it, it kind of pays for itself and helps us be a little bit more responsive out there in winter storms. And of course, to get the material into trucks, we need loaders. So again, those costs vary from a 2 cubic yard loader. It's around 126,000 to a 3 cubic yard unit that's could be 148. And then you can see the rest of the support equipment there that we need, but clearly the bigger number there is the core equipment. So if we go next, I just wanted to show a slide here. Here's what we pay. These are statewide averages for materials. And again, that's going to vary a lot. I think most of you know I'm from District 8, the asphalt cost in District 8. are a little bit lower than some of the areas of the state because we have a lot of producers. There's not as much mobilization needed depending on where that material is coming from. Average cost though is 55. Anti-skid, that's what we put in with our salt to try to provide a little traction during the winter time. You can see $18 a ton. Aggregate, general aggregate for backfilling and things like that, it's about 22. Liquid bituminous, that's a product that we use with our seal coating. So these two units here kind of go together. The seal coat stone 17, liquid bituminous. Again, keep in mind, these numbers now are a few years old. Most of them I think still pertain, but clearly liquid bituminous is probably up this year compared to where it was in 18-19. Paint, $1.23 a gallon. And then here's the real kicker. And again, most of you may know this, but it's worth bringing up. Salt. The average price of salt for a ton of salt in Pennsylvania is $63. So that's more than the price of asphalt. So that's why we try to make sure we're putting the right amount of materials down there. In some counties, I can tell you, pay above $80 a ton for salt. So let's go to the next. Here's the summary, the impact slide, so to speak. If we go to the next one, Paul. So again, just realizing the 1.34 billion. When you add all that up, and you're requiring all 67 counties to do this work, right now that money really isn't sufficient. So as you can see, 47 out of 67 counties, about 70%. I've really reached the point where when you prepare for winter, you do this basic maintenance, you pay your bills to be in your facility, so to speak, you pay your employees, you really have $0 left. And we've, of course, defined that as being broke. We have 12 additional counties that once you do all that you have above, there's about $1 million left in each of those counties to, again, go a little bit beyond the core maintenance, do some resurfacing, and do some bridge work. We define these as distressed counties. And again, someone would look at this and say, well, how is this possible? Well, what we have to do to survive and what we've been doing for the last few years is we're pulling money out of other areas of our operation. It's not significant dollars right now. I would say it's probably in the $40 to $50 million the last 2 years. But we have to prop up maintenance just to do those core maintenance activities. And again, I think this is a slide that everyone needs to remember as we move forward. We go to the next slide, Paul. I just have a couple left here. That first bullet point is a repeat from my presentation on roads and bridges. But again, we talked about maintenance and operations having unmet needs of 4.1 billion. And at that time, I mentioned that the county maintenance budgets, that would account for about 600 million. And again, that really just gets back to the adjustment for inflation from 05-06. You need about 600 million just to adjust for inflation. Now, I mentioned before, this is something we can do a little bit more work on, but if you really dive into our facilities across the Commonwealth, and you also take a look at our equipment, we're starting to extend the cycle life of our equipment. So instead of having a truck that gives you 12 years of service, we're trying to squeeze 14 years out of that. And there's some pretty good information that would say, hey, that's not the best, the best model out there, because those next 2 years you're spending X dollars more in repairs. And by the way, when you take that truck to an auction, you're getting less money back on that as well. So I would think there's an opportunity for us when we look at wrapping all this up to say what should we be investing in our equipment, and it's going to be higher than what it is right now. Same way with our facilities. Again, I know we have a big network out there when you have 67 county offices, but we do have some facilities that it's like anything else. The longer you wait, the more it's going to cost when you get to that point. So. What I will say, what this has also done is it has pulled money away from our construction program. Again, if you go back a number of years, Even with the 1.34 billion, we were able to add 150, 200 million to contracts because we do maintenance work with the private sector contractors out there. So right now that's starting to take a hit, but I would say if someone had a magic wand and we had 600 million back in maintenance, we would be doing more work again, not only with department forces, but also with the private sector, which is obviously good news there. So one thing I didn't say back when you looked at the maybe if we just go back quickly there, Paul, to the previous slide, if we can do that. With these dollars and these numbers in front of you, there is discussion about the maintenance formula and how money is distributed to the 67 counties. And while that's a good conversation to have, yeah, at the end of the day, the issue really is the 1.34 billion. It's not enough. So you could divide this up any number of ways. I think you can see here that a fair number of counties, are already being in the red, literally, as I mentioned. So again, Paul, let's just go to the last two slides then. I think I can get through this pretty quickly. We're going to dedicate some time, I believe, on our next T-Rock meeting to talk about efficiencies across the board. So I'm going to keep this pretty short. But the one thing I do come back to every time is you look on our website right now, we have 11,375 employees. I think our approved complement's just a little bit higher than that. But again, compared to where we were in the mid 70s, our agency is half of what it used to be in terms of employees. So I don't know what marks efficiencies more than that. Winter services, of course, we've really tried to get to the right spot on that over the last number of years. We do a lot of winter prep with planning, recruiting, and training. Use of salt brine is has increased. And why is that important? Well, a ton of salt can make upwards of 850 gallons of salt brine. So and pre-treating the salt before we put it on the roadways keeps the material where it needs to be. We do use a lot of routed rentals in the wintertime when we can get them. And we use a lot of rental equipment. Again, it's you pay a little bit more that day to use that equipment, but it's not a core piece of equipment that you're buying and you have sitting there, for the rest of the year outside of winter. Of course, we made use of our temporary operators. That's a struggle in terms of getting folks to come to work for us part-time for a few months. We bring people in October, and this last year we probably held some folks over through April with winter extending the way it did. But we do need those extra operators to try to give us more operators on the roadway. And if we get into a 24/7 or an extended event, it's really important to have those folks. Of course, there's been some advances in equipment. And then here's another plug that I'd really like to put out there. Winter maintenance agreements. It's important to leverage the local resources. They're out there plowing as well. We got to find a way to continue to do that and maybe grow that area. Again, quickly, some of the work that shifted, I'd say predominantly the private sector. Almost all of our guide rail installation goes that way. When I started at PennDOT a long time ago, every county office had a guide rail, a piece of equipment that pounded in the guide rail post. We just have a handful of them now. Same way with core borings. At District 8, we had a core boring rig. In fact, we had two of them. We had a skid rig that we could set out there portable for smaller projects. They're gone. That's done by the private sector. We do a lot of our mowing at the private sector level as well. So then the last slide here, Paul, is really just again, we've gone to regional and combined specialty crews, where you take two counties, you have a paving crew and a surface treating crew, but those counties travel back and forth, so obviously less equipment to do that. We've gone through a county accreditation, and it really continues to be really part of our process where we're looking at all operations for cost savings and efficiencies, and that includes letting go of some things that we feel we can get a better product or a better cost value with the private sector. Again, the equipment sharing I talked about, that happens district to district, but also at the county levels. We have some new products there for high wrap. That's recycled asphalt that can be used on the lower roadways. You know, as producers start to develop that, those prices will come down like anything else. When you first start, you look at a wrap product, you say, well, I can get what I'm getting today without that higher wrap, but they'll drop as we continue to increase that. We have mobile equipment teams, which again, we move those around the state. That's pretty important as well to make sure if we have a big event, especially a snowstorm, that you know, we're moving folks and moving equipment to the right locations. And then certainly but not the least important, our traffic management centers and our ICC Incident Command Center gives us an opportunity to you know, coordinate across the state, coordinate with PEMA, PSP. That's been a big change in our process here the last number of years. And again, Paul, I know we're up against the clock here, but that's the extent of my presentation. And I don't know if anyone has any questions. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to have to ask that we do the questions virtually and silently, because we do have a responsibility to make sure that members of the public. So, Mike, I will use your clever little slide here to invite any members of the public who are connecting by telephone and who do not otherwise have a means of submitting comments to speak with the full group. If you do, please keep your comments very brief. 1 to 2 minutes would be ideal. I hate to have to cut somebody off. Seems very rude. Well, excellent. I think the 7 was good luck. Not that we don't want to hear from the public. And, you know, it does occur to me that Mike used to run a district that I think incorporated what once was District 7. So I thought of your opening comment, Secretary. They got me the first time I did training for PennDOT 28 years ago and told me they were from District 7, and I believed them. So. Hope we may have a comment. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Stephanie Kane from the Alliance for Toll-Free Interstates. Thank you. I'll keep it as brief as I can. I've been listening along and there's been a lot of great discussion, but I would really like the members of the commission to understand that tolls are not a user fee. They're taxes hiding in plain sight. They'll increase shipping costs for goods, suppressing consumer activity, double taxing businesses and drivers who pay for roads with fuel taxes, discriminate against marginalized communities, divert traffic onto local roads to the detriment of those communities near the toll facilities, and disrupt the free flow of goods along the Commonwealth's travel corridors. Tolls reroute prosperity around the communities where they're located, and which needs to be taken more seriously than the Commission seems to be considering. Not only are these myriad negative economic and societal impacts, but tolls are incredibly inefficient as a form of taxation. There are enormous costs for administration and collection. And one example from 2018, an all electronic toll called the North Carolina Expressway near Raleigh spent a whopping 36.8% of revenues on its administrations and operations. That money never went to the road itself. To the point about volume needs for tolling and these revenue projections, with rare exception, actual toll traffic in many countries has failed to reproduce forecasted traffic levels. According to a report from the Denver Post, there is no incentive for the tolling estimates to be accurate. Even when wrong, the bonds are simply refinanced and the consultants are paid again for their work on new studies to support the new bonds. And one last point, this plan leaves Pennsylvania's fate in the hands of the federal government, which is absolutely not guaranteed. We would advise the Commission not to heed the public outcry against the bridge tolls, plan. Opposition to tolls is never greater than when people realize they will actually have to pay them and face all these unintended consequences. The reality is that people drive around tolls and there will be other consequences to these areas. Tolls are a perfect example of a cure worse than the disease it seeks to treat, and we sincerely hope the Commission will move away from a widespread tolling plan for Pennsylvania. Thank you for your time. I'd be happy to provide any source documents or further information if there are questions.
Yeah, Stephanie, we're not questioning back to the public, but you are certainly welcome to provide any links or whatever might be appropriate through the portal. We thank you for your comments and for your preparation, keeping it concise.
Thank you.
Any others? With that, Secretary, we are right up against the time, and I know some people have to peel off, but what a full meeting we had. Back to you.
Indeed, Paul, thank you very much. Thanks to Jenny and Mike for important and informative presentations. Thanks to all the commission members for the great work they did on their reports. It is essential that T-ROC understand the challenges associated with maintaining our extensive state highway and bridge network, and likewise understanding the dynamic changes of distribution and delivery as this bears on how our transportation system operates and how it's funded. I'm encouraged by the progress towards developing a strategic funding proposal to address the great need that must be addressed. Clearly, there are options in how we might fund transportation improvements, and Pennsylvania needs and deserves solutions that will support transportation for future generations. The next 5 weeks will demand the best from us. I know all involved will rise to that occasion. I look forward to our work ahead. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Thank you very much. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you all. And that's it from T-ROC Studios on this beautiful Thursday afternoon in Pennsylvania. So please enjoy the outdoors as much as you can, and we will be back in touch very soon.